My name is Yann Clough. I'm a landscape and agroecologist working at the Center for Environmental and Climate Research here in Lund. What I'm going to talk about today is work we have done as part of a team here in Lund on evaluating effects of different CAP greening alternatives on ecosystem services, but also other aspects of, let's say, agriculture and administration of, let's say, the agricultural system. And so it's not just me who stands behind this, it's lots of people, many of them are in the room today. The project was funded by Naturvårdsverket, the Swedish EPA, as part of their work in a group which binds together several organizations and is dedicated to studying the environmental effects of the CAP, both past and present. Additional funding was enjoyed by myself and Euler through two projects, EcoDeal and Staccato, which were part of an ERANET, Biodiversa and FATCA GPI joint call. Right. Ecological focus areas will be familiar to some of you here in the room. They are a part of the Common Agricultural Policy and a new part which was introduced during the greening reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. And the principle, there's lots of details to this, but roughly farmers, if they have more than 15 hectare farm land, are supposed to set aside 50% of the cropland to a certain set of ecological focus areas which should benefit biodiversity directly or indirectly. So in each country or region in Europe, farmers are presented with a menu of different choices of types of land use that they can declare as ecological focus areas. And one of the hopes is also that these ecological focus areas don't only bolster biodiversity, but also a range of different ecosystem services linked to biodiversity, such as pollination of crops by wild bees, an example here with a bumblebee pollinating oilseed rape, and the natural control of pests by wild, some natural enemies, such as this syrphid fly here, eating up aphids. And the questions in the project were, how can we better support pollination and natural pest control through ecological focus areas? And what is the potential of collective or collaborative implementation of ecological focus areas in this respect? I'm going to show a little bit what that entails. So this is it's a true landscape, but it's a hypothetical example. I mean, the farms and the farmers, in this landscape were not sort of directly associated with the project. I just grabbed this from Google Earth. Just assume this is a farm. So this farm might then choose as an ecological focus area to declare a fallow here, or let's say plant a flower strip here. And these ecological focus areas, because they have a diversity of different plants and flowering plants, have then the potential to support beneficials such as wild bees and natural enemies of pests, for instance, and then can just contribute to supporting crop production on the farm. The issue of collaboration comes up because one has realized that if a central farmer, so we're focusing still on this farm here in the middle, if that farmer implements, let's say, a flower strip here, this will benefit wild bees such as these bumblebees, and these will they will be benefited not just on the farm but also benefit the wild bee populations in the wider landscape. So there will be kind of a spillover of the benefits of implementing this wildflower strip to land potentially owned by then the neighboring farmers. And this has been highlighted as one of the reasons why farmers tend to not really invest in ecosystem services dependent on mobile organisms, because essentially you do something on your farm, it might increase the number of beneficial insects on your farm, but these are sort of then also using the rest of the landscape. So you're not really benefiting from the response of the wild organisms to your management implementations. So the idea with the collective implementation of the ecological focus areas, that one would be able then to, if the farmers collaborate, then to find effective ways of putting out ecological focus areas to support these ecosystem services at lower cost and at a larger effect across these different farms. So that's where that idea comes from. And so the idea with the EFAs is then how things could work is that you put EFAs, it increases vegetation diversity, the flower cover in the landscape, that increases beneficial insects, and that gives ecosystem services and benefits to the farmer. In addition to the increase in biodiversity. And the idea then with collective implementation is that it works even better because you kind of collaborate and give some thought on where to put things in the landscape. How do you assess whether collective implementation, which is something that is possible to do at the European level, but which Sweden as a country has not chosen to do. So Swedish farmers can't collectively implement the ecological focus areas in the way that, for instance, Dutch farmers can. How do you decide whether that's a good thing or not? So we have, one of the reasons why we were asked by Naturvårdsverket to whether we could do this study is because within the group we've had experience in doing synthesis of ecological knowledge, not just, let's say, through meta-analysis and literature reviews, but also through bringing the numbers together, our knowledge about the processes and creating ecological models which then, for a given landscape, allow you to simulate how, let's say, the different organisms move between the different patches in the landscape using sort of nesting resources and flower resources, and what that means both for the population sizes of the different beneficial insects, the biodiversity in the system, and the ecosystem services to the crops. So being a landscape ecologist, so my first reaction to this was, okay, we're gonna have a little bit, as I showed you in these different images that I showed before, different management alternatives, and then we run ecological models, and then we see what the results are in terms of ecosystem performance. So we have our hammer, which is the ecosystem service modeling. There's the question. So we have one hammer, one nail. But then talking to colleagues and thinking this over again, we realized that it's probably better to have another more complex approach to this, which looks like this. So essentially, because the decisions on the ground are made by farmers, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's important to start really with the policy alternatives, and then see how farmers react to these different alternatives, because they have a menu of different choices what to do. They are also doing other choices in terms of which crops to grow, which might also depend on their which ecological focus areas they are able to choose. So we fed these policy alternatives into a farmer agent-based economic model, where the farming agents can be presented with different constraints, just representing different options how to implement ecological focus areas. But also talked to real farmers to see how they experience the possibilities and barriers that have to do with these ecological focus areas. And based on that knowledge, it was possible to then take GIS maps of the landscape and implement the land use changes to those maps that represent the outcomes of the different policy alternatives and how they then translate into changes in land use by the farmers. Which were then used as an input into the ecological modeling, which was our step of inference to then come to an ecosystem service performance measure for each of these policy alternatives. In addition to that, we conducted interviews with the administration to get an idea of the barriers and transaction costs. Because obviously, if you have a system which is geared towards handling payments to individual farmers, if you suddenly have groups of farmers collaborating and jointly declaring their ecological focus areas and so on, that doesn't work. So you have a certain form of institutional lock-in into how things are dealt with on a day-to-day basis. And that really needs to feed into the overall performance of the policy alternatives as well in order to be relevant for the policymakers. So essentially, we ended up using all these different tools to really answer this question. So we had 6 months for this project. So there was a certain degree of scaling down in the intensity in in the different steps. So the workshops were not huge workshops done repeatedly, and the ecosystem service models were done also in a relatively efficient way, and the interviews were not dozens of interviews, but a relatively small number, intensive interviews. So the findings, I'm going to go quite quickly over this, but the finding essentially is that this whole logic fails already quite early on, because essentially EFA doesn't really translate into biodiversity effects. And this is due to it is not due to lack of collective implementation or anything, but it's due to the fact that the menu of ecological focus areas, so that what farmers can choose to declare, contains measures which are really poor for biodiversity on average. So both farmers can declare leys, but they are mostly only grass, or a few flowering species. Nitrogen fixing crops can in principle be things that are really valuable for biodiversity, but in practice they end up as being mainly peas and field beans, which have limited benefits for beneficial insects, even those that are using them sometimes, such as bumblebees. And then fallows and uncropped field borders. Those are actually the ones that have the greatest potential to benefit biodiversity and beneficial animals, but the uptake is very low for these different land uses. And for the uncropped field borders, one of the issues is that there is a weighing scores. So if you have, so for fallow is sort of standard, has 1. And so if you have a hectare of fallow, that counts as a hectare of ecological focus area. If you have nitrogen fixing crops, then you need to have slightly more than a hectare for it to count as an hectare of ecological focus area. If you have uncropped field borders, though, they're counted by length. So it's a little bit bizarre, but if you sort of take the numbers and do the maths, it means that if you have a hectare of uncropped field borders, it counts as much as 9 hectares of ecological focus areas. So, of course, yes, you do have quite some uptake of uncropped field borders in the region here, but in terms of hectareage, it's very little, which if you drive around is what you see. And then the third issue is that there's low requirements on implementation. So you see this is a fallow, it's a brown fallow. Then you have a nice fallow here, but clearly both of these actually count as EFAs. So you can see that this is probably quite good for biodiversity and for beneficial insects, and this is probably even worse than, you know, the usual crop. And the same pattern is also seen with the uncropped field borders. So you have uncropped field borders which are repeatedly ploughed up. You have some with spontaneous vegetation, and you have some which are sown in with flower mixes, and I think the idea is that it should look somewhat like this. So clearly, one of the recommendations is that one could increase the quality requirements for certain EFAs on the menu, but we realized, and that is really one of the benefits of the farmer agent-based model, that if you increase the requirements, so you make farmers have to sort of sow in flower mixes, for instance, that also increases the costs, not hugely, but a bit. So farmers then automatically implement even less of these strips and more of, let's say, nitrogen fixing crops or sowing in lays. So really the conclusion is that you need to restrict the ecological focus area menu to measures with high biodiversity effects. Soon as if you have measures with less biodiversity effects which are attractive to farmers, you will get very little of this, to use sort of CAP terminology, sort of dark green, really valuable habitats. Now, what about collaboration? Well, in terms of the collaboration, remember this, this graph here. You see that if you restrict the EFA types to types that really directly support biodiversity, because each farmer is then obliged to implement them, it then doesn't really make much difference where they are, whether they are talking about where they should put them, because you will have automatically on each farm some flower strips or some some fallows with flowers. So the additional benefit of actually coordinating is there, but is fairly minute. So collective implementation is an interesting option for farmers because it gives them the option to communicate, to exchange, also about the practicalities of how to manage for certain types of vegetation and so on. I did go into the detail here, but it's a nightmare for Swedish administrators in the current context, where the current system is already of sort of paying out direct payments in the CAP doesn't work very well, so there's a limited added value ecologically, but you can argue that there are some important benefits here of collective implementation that come out of the interviews, not necessarily out of ecological modeling exercises. So we have a set of quite clear recommendations, and it was quite interesting process for me as an ecologist, let's say, to really take this interdisciplinary approach together with my colleagues, because it is quite clear that that our findings and our recommendations would not have been the same if we'd applied a classical sort of single discipline, purely ecological modeling approach. But it gives a much more comprehensive picture of the barriers and possibilities which are out there. Okay, sorry for going a little bit over time. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.